Okay, you might have heard this news recently that EA CEO Andrew Wilson pocketed a casual $38.6 million in bonus pay, an $8 million increase from the previous year, mostly driven by the record-breaking sales of Battlefield 6. But this came just a few months after EA laid off an undisclosed number of developers across the very studios responsible for making it: DICE, Criterion, Ripple Effect, and Motive. Among others, it wasn't just Battlefield. You know, the corporate way of saying, thank you for your service. So, I thought it could be interesting to look into what the biggest problem in the AAA gaming industry is right now. And, surprise, it's not massive layoffs, and it's not just the greedy executives. Those are simply consequences of the root problem. And in my opinion, that is investors. And I don't mean individual people that invest in video games, I mean the financial structure behind everything. Now, yes, while EA is no longer a publicly traded company, as it recently finalized being acquired by the private investment group led by Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund for $55 billion with a B dollars. We'll get into that later in the video. It is still a great example because changing the owner won't really change the underlying problem. So, we'll go over why the studios keep getting these massive layoffs despite making genuinely successful games, why budgets keep spiraling out of control, and honestly, why it may not be possible for a lot of them to simply change the course. So let's get into it. First, I want to get into why these layoffs happen. To understand this, we need to look at how staffing scales across the different phases of making a AAA game. And keep in mind, any numbers I bring up are just examples of rough estimates. They vary quite a bit from studio to studio and from project to project even. So in pre-production, a project usually has anywhere between 30 to 100 people. This stage is mostly focuses on like the vision and setup. So you will see creative directors, concept artists, lead designers, and tech architects being hired. As the game moves into full production, that team will ramp up massively. The closer you get to release, the higher that number will climb, easily swelling to 500, 800, or even more than 1,000 developers when you factor in external outsourcing. That is when you bring in the big guns. The level designers, animators, 3D artists, audio engineers, and later you get QA testers and localization teams. Then, once the game ships and you move into post-launch, the required work drops off a cliff. The majority of employees simply don't have much work, if any at all. So, what happens to those developers after launch? Ideally, they will be reassigned to other projects inside the company. But this brings us to a major structural problem. In companies that are too big, like for example EA, moving people around isn't always so simple. Proprietary game engines, specialized toolsets, or simply not having other projects far enough along to absorb hundreds of artists means there is nowhere for them to go. And that leaves these studios with the other option, which is layoffs. Now you might be thinking, okay, but if a game is a massive success and makes hundreds of millions of dollars, why can't the company just keep those developers on payroll while the next game gets ready? Well, this brings us back to the root cause, the investors' expectations. You see, publicly traded publishers are judged by Wall Street on 90-day cycles. Investors aren't looking at a studio's 5-year artistic health. They're looking at quarterly operating margins and profit per employee ratios. The moment a game ships and hits store shelves, all that upfront sales revenue gets recognized on the balance sheet. If a publisher keeps 500 developers on payroll during the early pre-production phase of the next project, when they aren't actively essentially doing nothing, those salaries become what corporate finance calls unallocated overhead. And to an investor, that sounds like money flying off the wallet. So to protect those quarterly profit margins and boost the stock price right after a big release, many publishers treat human workforce like a flexible line item. They overhire, often through short-term contracts, but not all the time, to force the game across the finish line by a specific fiscal deadline. That's why you have throughout the year different sections of the year where a bunch of games are set to release. For example, September is full. That is most likely because they're being set before a specific fiscal deadline. And the second that deadline passes, they cut those developers loose to make the company's balance sheet look as lean as possible for the next earnings call. This explains a little bit why you get games like Battlefield 6, and then a few months later they get restructuring, quote-unquote, and a bunch of people get laid off. This is a system where executives get rewarded twice. Once for the record-breaking launch sales, and again for cutting payroll costs immediately afterward. Now, as a bit of a side note, I understand some people will think, well, if they are bad at their jobs, they should be fired. And while I do agree, this isn't about games that flop massively and the company simply can't sustain itself. That's a whole different conversation, and with all the layoffs, all the clips from the developers at Bethesda and the Halo ones recently, I'm sure there is a lot of people in those teams that rightfully deserve to be fired because they're simply not doing a good job. But this is more about general practices. Now, the next piece of the puzzle is the budgets. It's no secret that AAA game budgets have ballooned, jumping from 20 to 50 million back in the PS3 and Xbox 360 era to over $600 million. Hell, GTA 6 is still rumored to have cost well over $1 billion. That makes every single release significantly riskier and far more damaging if it happens to, quote-unquote, underperform. So another question that might pop into your head is, okay, why not just make cheaper games? Well, this ties back to something I have mentioned quite a bit. Today, it is actually cheaper and easier to make video games than ever before. That's how small teams and even solo developers manage to make incredible games that look genuinely good. And while that scales differently in massive productions, the basic principle is the same. The more you refine your engine and workflow, the easier and cheaper it should be to run a project. But in AAA, that's just not what happens. So why is that? Well, a big part comes down to the financial structure behind these companies, as I mentioned before. When these companies receive a lot of money from investment, they need to spend it. Now, they're not obligated to spend every single cent, but the more they spend and they show they're spending it in new technology or, oh, this game is going to be massive and bigger, it's easier for them to sell it to new investors and even their current shareholders in order to get more money. Now, as a bit of a cascading effect, if a company comes and spends $300 million in a video game, and that video game comes out and is a massive success, sells tens of millions of copies, everyone loves it, gets fantastic reviews, the next company will look at that and think, you know what, we have to spend more money in our games. So the next company spends that money, gets more investment. Let's say, for the sake of argument, the second company also makes a surefire hit. Then the third company will want an even bigger piece of that pie, so they will spend even more money. So on, and so on, and so on. And because you still have the successful examples, some of these companies will still be thinking, even if you have massive flops, they will still think, oh, but they did this wrong, so we're going to spend more money in order to make it better. Because they're publicly traded, the executives of these companies have a strict fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. Now, a lot of people seem to think that means they are legally forced to maximize shareholder value above all else. But in reality, it's about acting in the best financial interest of the company. So technically, a board could make the argument that keeping skilled developers on a payroll for a future project protects the company's long-term value. But in reality, to many of these companies, like EA, Ubisoft, it's much simpler to lay off people and make the balance sheet look better, so it's easier to get more investment and keep shareholders happy with short-term growth. On top of that, executives are judged on how they spend that money. So they can't just take a massive pile of profit and use it as a safety net to keep hundreds of developers on payroll during a 2-year downtime. Because investors will look at that money and ask why it's not being used to make more money. Now, I'm sure someone with a degree in economics is going to tell me, oh, but they actually can. Yes, they can. But it all comes back to many times it's just easier to do it this way for them. And this actually leads to another problem. They end up spending all the money. So if a game flops, they're out of money. The investors aren't happy because the game flopped and it's not making any more money. The company is on the red because they spend most of it to make it. So what do? Massive layoffs. So, is public investment purely bad for the industry as a whole? No, of course not. In fact, it's that level of massive capital investment that allows companies to make those giant high-budget games like Assassin's Creed, Call of Duty, Halo. Okay, you know what? Maybe it is all bad. Jokes aside, there are obvious benefits to this, but the system has simply grown too bloated. We keep getting endless sequels and remakes because they are predictable. There is very little financial risk involved. All things considered, there is, of course, bad remakes, but they're usually seen as a surefire bet. Investors like them because, people are going to buy the game again. It's prettier now. They're going to get more money. You can tell that to Halo Studios. So that leaves new, inventive ideas left almost entirely to AA and indie studios that operate on completely different playbooks. A great example, even if it's a bit overused by now, it's Larian Studios. Now, as a bit of an asterisk, Larian Studios is a particularly successful AA studio. It's not the norm. But because Larian is private and CEO Sven Vinke maintains majority control, they can play for long-term sustainability. When building Baldur's Gate 3, they built in safety nets, so that even if the game underperformed in the short term, the studio wouldn't collapse overnight. They wouldn't need massive layoffs. Now, obviously, no studio can survive a string of massive flops. I'm talking about well-made, well-received games that generate steady profit over time rather than relying on huge sales day one. But if you think all public gaming companies are trapped in this cycle, I have another example for you. Capcom, of which I made a recent video comparing it to Ubisoft. It's pretty good, you should go watch it. Capcom seems to do the exact opposite of companies like Activision or Ubisoft. I know Activision is not a public company, but as we'll get into later, it is a good comparison. Over the last decade, Capcom has posted consecutive years of record-breaking profits. So how? Well, that's because Capcom has built their business for long term. And a huge part of that is the RE engine. You may know that the Resident Evil remakes and the newest games, from 7 onward, are built on this engine. But did you also know that Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter Rise, Monster Hunter Wilds, Street Fighter 6, and even Pragmata have all also been built on the same engine? Because their internal pipeline is so optimized, they can make games that rival most other AAA games for much less cost. Plus, they focus heavily on back catalog, long-tail sales. I brought this up before, but it's just wild. Devil May Cry 5 had its single best sales year 7 years after release, pushing 2.7 million copies in fiscal year 2026, which ended like 1 month ago. And because of that shared engine and pipeline, Capcom doesn't need to fire hundreds of developers after shipping a game. they move those teams seamlessly into different projects, which means they can retain highly experienced world-class talent. Also, Capcom doesn't rely almost at all into contracted workers and outsourcing. Okay, so what about EA? As I mentioned, EA is no longer public as it was acquired for the funny $55 billion. On paper, you will think this solves the exact problem we've been talking about. By delisting from the stock market and taking a massive cash injection, EA no longer has to report to Wall Street every 90 days, they don't have public shareholders breathing down their neck demanding quarterly margin growth. You will think this will give them the freedom to operate more like Capcom or even Larian, to take risks, creative risks, invest in long-term development, and stop this post-launch layoff cycle. But in reality, going private under private equity doesn't solve the problem. It just changes who holds the debt. You see, deals like a $55 billion buyout don't happen using just liquid cash sitting in a bank. They are structured as leverage buyouts, or LBOs. The private equity firms take out massive billions of dollar loans to acquire the company and then transfer that debt into EA's balance sheet. Suddenly, EA isn't trying to satisfy thousands of public stock traders, they're trying to serve high interest debt payments to private equity funds who want to recoup their multi-billion dollar investment. And how do these private firms guarantee a return on this massive debt? Well, cost cutting and aggressive monetization. Instead of solving the root problem, going private under this model can actually intensify the pressure. The need for immediate cash flow to service debt means headcount gets squeezed even harder, live service monetization gets pushed even more aggressively, and safe, established franchises like Battlefield or EA Sports FC are forced to carry even heavier financial burdens. Changing the owner doesn't fix the broken incentive model if the new owner is running the exact same rules. Hell, massive layoffs are already being reported as they intend to cut around $700 million in cost. Also, as a bit of collateral, this will bring less transparency, as they are no longer mandated to do earnings reports or executive compensation packages. So, to wrap it up, from some of the examples you may think that the underlying problem is actually leadership, executives. As with a strong leadership and clear vision, a public company can definitely make great quality products without overly monetizing them, like the case with Capcom or even Take-Two. And while you are not wrong, what I mean by saying investors are the biggest problem is that the entire financial architecture makes it far too easy for executives to fall into the short-term cash trap. The system is designed to reward immediate balance sheet fixes over long-term sustainability. And to circle back to our friend Andrew Wilson and his payout, while I know executive bonuses are tied to financial metrics and revenue targets and not simply managing employees, personally, I believe that if you ship a commercially successful game and you have to lay off permanent employees to meet earnings targets, that should be considered a failure in leadership and should impact any potential compensation to executives. But again, the system doesn't care about that as far as the growth metrics are met. Unfortunately, there is really no solution to this. This is the way the system works. Sure, a crash of the industry would do the trick, though. A massive collapse could be a solution. You know, to quote the great Ra's al Ghul,
"The forest grows too wild, a purging fire is inevitable and natural."
For example, if one monstrous game with a lot of investment and publicity were to catastrophically fail, the biggest example you can think of is GTA 6, and I want to make this clear, not even for a second I believe that's going to happen. It's going to be a massive success. But if a game like that, with as much attention, and I don't mean from gamers, I mean from Wall Street, and so much investment and so much money put into making the game, if GTA 6 were to come out and flop miserably, for whatever reason, let's say, oh, suddenly nobody cares about it, I believe it will bring down the collapse of at least the AAA side of the industry. You see, some people will think, oh, one game wouldn't do that. No, it's not about the game itself or the company itself. It's that investors would immediately panic because GTA 6 is poised as this surefire hit, that game that can't fail. So it's a safe bet. So people invest on Take-Two. If the game were suddenly to flop, the stock of the company will drop so fast, could even go under. But it's not even about that. It's that investors that want to invest in video game companies, they will suddenly think twice and they will hold any potential investment. So this will affect any other company that is publicly traded. Suddenly their stock will drop as a ripple effect. Sadly, that would also bring down many smaller studios and companies that really do things well. Now, to repeat myself, this is not something I believe is going to happen. Well, I do think the AAA side of the industry at least is dropping. We've seen it time and time again. I've brought that up in previous videos. People are buying less and less high production, high budget games at full price. And companies keep pushing to increase prices. GTA 6 is doing it. That will speed up the decline. Because if people are no longer buying them at $70 in general, I'm talking about general, they're going to buy them even less at $80. People keep buying smaller, cheaper, indie level games. The sweet spot for like what most people pay for video games on Steam, it's around $20. That doesn't mean $70 games don't sell. It means that percentage-wise, there is a lot more people buying cheaper games than more expensive ones. So the industry is going down in that direction. So, now I'm going to turn it to you. Do you agree? Or what do you think is the biggest problem in the AAA gaming industry? What other examples of good or bad public companies do you think? Either way, thank you for watching. Leave a like if you enjoy the video. Subscribe if you haven't. And I hope you have a wonderful day. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.